skateboarding down Oxford Road. I mean, probably the rest of you Singapore for that. But, okay, let's say skateboarding down Oxford Street. Quite usual to see people on skateboards or roller skates. But if I saw somebody of 50 or 60 years old doing it, you'd say, that's not right for that age group. Shouldn't be doing it. Going to nightclubs, things like this, not really seems appropriate to people of that age. So there are socially prescribed ways of behaving according to the age group, of dressing, of what you should wear, of the way you should speak, the way you should conduct yourself, the way you should things like what profession you're in, what occupation do you have. Does a professor behave differently from a person who sweeps the roads? Are different standards of behaviour, different styles of behaviour expected of them? Do they dress in the same way? No. Do they have the same hobbies? Do they have the same social networks? No. Do they do the same things? No. I'm not saying one is better than the other. These are different roles. If you take someone who is in the military and someone who is an artist, there are different ways of behaving associated with these different roles. And the opportunity to deviate from those are relatively limited. Because if you do deviate from those expectations, people around you, there are social sanctions which you feel I'm behaving inappropriately in this context. You're brought back on the straight and narrow by these social processes. So social roles are things which we conform to, all of us, but which are not natural features of that role. So for example, we have lots of roles. You're all playing lots of roles. What roles do you play at the moment? Give me some examples. What role do you play now? Student. Okay. But what else are you? Daughter, son, mother, father, possibly, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, member of the SIM Hot Air Ballooning Society, member of the SIM, have you got an eating society or something yet? Member of the SIM Pole Vaulting Society. Anybody? No. Anybody play sport? You're not going to tell. I maybe do. There's somebody who plays sport. Anyone a member of a team? So you have a role in relation to your membership of that team. So at the same time, you can occupy many different roles. Some people might have part-time jobs. You can be a student and a cashier in a shop, or a student and a mechanic. You can occupy different roles at the same time. But it doesn't really change who you are. You are you, but you occupy and slot in to different roles in society. Again, it's by looking at roles rather than people that sociologists try to understand why roles, which are the components of social institutions, have the characteristics that they have. Why are they like they are? So that's one question. The other question they ask is, how do people come to adopt those patterns of behaviour which are necessary for the role to be enacted? So the next question is, well, why? Why do we have social roles in the way that we do? Why do we have these institutions? And why do we have the roles that go to make them up? Why are they like the way they are? Well, most sociologists say that the institutions in society and the social roles that make them up are not random, but have an explanation. They have a reason for being the way they are. And the job of the sociologist is to try to explain why these roles are as they are, and the institutions that are made up by them are actually the way that they manifest themselves. So I'm going to give you one example here, which is a slightly odd example, but I think it illustrates the point. You'll come across this named Talcott Parsons. He was an American sociologist writing in the 1940s onwards, who made a huge contribution to the development of sociology. His writings are almost impossible to read. So if you go to the library and you pick up a copy of The Structure of Social Action by Talcott Parsons, and you open it and you don't understand it, don't worry, because that's normal. So Parsons is very different, but Parsons tried to do this and explain why, first of all, how roles exist where we don't think they do, and secondly, how they can have, in his case, positive functions, positive benefits for the whole society, but which are not obviously apparent to us. So he talks about this example of the sick role. Now, when you're sick, when you're ill, do you think you're playing a role? Are you playing a social role when you're sick? You're just sick, aren't you? But Parsons points out, actually, there are socially acceptable ways of being ill. It's not just the consequences of the disease itself. First of all, he says, there are certain rights that you acquire when you're sick. Certain things you're allowed to do that ordinarily you're not allowed to do. Can anybody think of something you're allowed to do when you're sick that you're not allowed to do at other times? Sleep, stay at home, yeah? Exactly. So if you ring up your boss and say, I'm not coming in today, I'm afraid, because I'm very sick, what does the boss say? Okay, yeah, stay at home, get better soon. Thank you for telling me. If you ring up your boss and say, I'm not coming to work today because I can't be bothered. I had a really heavy night in Newton Circus last night. I don't think I can get in because I'm hungover and tired. What will your boss say to you? You're sacked. Go. So you are given the right to exempt yourself from work and other normal social events. If you're scheduled to go out with your friends tonight and you ring them up and say, I'm really sorry, I've got a really bad sore throat and a bad cold, I'm afraid I can't make it tonight. They say, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. Okay, well, sorry we won't see you, but hope you get better soon and we'll see you soon. That's what they say to you. Ring up your friend and say, I've decided not to go out with you tonight because I think you're boring. Or I've decided not to go out with you tonight because I've had a better offer. They get very upset, don't they? I'm sure none of you would do that, but they get upset, angry, bitter. Now what Parsons is pointing out then is that the sick person in our society acquires these rights. He says also, though, they acquire certain obligations, certain things they are expected to do in return for the rights that they're granted. So what are you expected to do if you're sick? Stay home and get better. Primarily, do whatever is necessary to recover. Comply with the instructions of the doctor. So if you're sick, you call the doctor says, well, you've got X, take these tablets. And you say to your friends, well, the doctor's given me some tablets, but I'm not going to take them. Throw them away. Well, your friends say, well, why? That's bad. You're sick, you need to get better. And it's not just that you're hurting yourself, but you're failing in your obligation as a sick person to do all that is within your power to get better as soon as possible. Society, your boss, your friends, the other institutions in society expect you to do what is necessary to get better. A sick person who says, no, I didn't bother to go to the doctor, I just stayed at home. Or a sick person who does things to make their sickness worse are morally as well as socially culpable. So, for example, there was a huge debate in the UK about things like whether people who smoke, people who are fat, who drink a lot, should be allowed to be treated by the National Health Service because their conditions are thought to be somehow self-inflicted. There are debates about whether people who don't wear seatbelts, I personally think laws requiring people to wear seatbelts are completely and utterly indefensible. But we have them, you have them. So if I drive my car and I don't put a seatbelt on, I can be fined for that. It's insane. But nevertheless, the argument goes, if I have a car crash and I injure myself and I'm not wearing a seatbelt, I'm somehow morally culpable because I didn't take reasonable steps to prevent myself, in this case, from entering the sick world. I could have done and I didn't. So Parsons says, actually even being ill is a social as well as a biological process. Yes, biological things happen, disease is disease, but there are social aspects to it and expected forms of behaviour for people who become sick. And then he asks the question, well, why do we have this sick role? And his answer is very simple. Society and the institutions in society need people who are healthy to fulfill the roles in that institution. So if we didn't have these expectations that you can take time off, but you've got to get better as quickly as possible, then the very institutions of society will be threatened to a much greater degree than they are by sickness. It actually makes the institutions of society work smoothly in the face of a biological event, which we can't do very much about. But we have a set of rules and expectations which are manifested in the sick role, which exist to secure the social institutions, the institutions in society. And that's how Parsons explained it. Now we have to then, I think, ask some other questions. Parsons' assumption was that really the sick role is good for everyone. It's good for the sick person because it returns them to health as soon as possible. But more importantly, it's good for the whole of society because the institutions we depend on are not threatened by people being sick. Imagine, in this case, the sick role didn't apply to lecturers at SIM. Imagine that all of your lecturers, once they were sick, they either carried on trying to teach you when they were sick, spreading disease, being unintelligible, collapsing on the stage, or that they decided they weren't going to bother trying to get better, and then you basically didn't see them again. The functioning of this institution would be seriously jeopardized by that. And so the functioning of this institution is not good just for you, but it's actually good for all the parties for Singaporean society in general, because we're educating the elite workforce of the next generation. So that's why SIM exists. But one or two types of sociologists have pointed out sometimes social roles might benefit certain groups or certain individuals more than others. So, let's take the example of gender. A very well-known British sociologist called Anne Oakley did a major study of housework in the UK. Long time ago now, but concluded that housework was predominantly done by women. They did a lot more of it than men. They did it much more routinely than men. And they tended to do all the nasty jobs, whereas men would do the lighter and more interesting jobs. So even if men did contribute to housework, they never cleaned toilets, for example. They would do the kind of lighter and more palatable things, possibly repairs around the house or carrying the rubbish, the trash outside, that kind of thing. But actually the really nasty jobs the women got. So Oakland points out here that in the female gender role, that is the idea that women are more passive, and tend to stay at home and look after children more, they tend to be obedient to their husbands, all these stereotypes. They tend to do the cooking. Actually, that role benefits men more than it benefits women. So instead of saying the role exists because it's good for society, feminists basically say the role exists because it's good for men. And men are the ones that have all the power in society. They describe society as a patriarchy. It's an institution just dominated by men for men. So the role of woman benefits men. So does the role of men benefit men, according different slant on this. We're trying to explain the nature of particular roles. Now, the roles, as we've said, have nothing to do with personality. You'll follow the feminine role because that's what society determines that you will do. But in following that role, you are inadvertently and unintentionally benefiting men at your expense and at the expense of all women. So that's the argument that feminists use. Every time you pick up an iron, you're ruining the lives of the sisters, all your sisters. Unless it's to hit your husband over the head with it, in which case it's an act of liberation. So social roles may, therefore, have their origins in unequal economic relationships. An example being, let's take doctors. Now you think on the one hand, well, doctor, thinking back to Parsons, and this is what Parsons argues, the role of doctor is good for society. Why is the role of doctor good for society? Because doctors make sick people better. Simple as that. For Parsons, the doctor's role actually mirrors the sick role. The doctor has certain rights. He can examine you in ways that ordinary people can't. He can get access to information about you that other people would not have a right to ask. But he has certain obligations as well. He has to be neutral, he has to be professional, he has to treat you as in a highly specialised way. In other words, he can examine your body, but not as he has to divorce himself from any normal association of intimacy in that situation. So he's altruistic in that sense. However, the Marxists point out, actually, doctors are not altruistic at all. The doctor's role doesn't benefit the whole of society. Who actually benefits from the role of doctors? Well, the argument goes something like this. Most medical knowledge is generated by pharmaceutical companies. Because actually most of the research done in medical science is funded by pharmaceutical companies. But pharmaceutical companies don't fund research for the good of humanity, they fund research for the profit of the pharmaceutical company. So for example, one of the biggest killers in the world is malaria. How much research is done on malaria? Much less research than is done on drugs to combat depression and anxiety. So if you look at the pharmaceutical revolutions over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been two really. First, the introduction of widespread use of tranquilizers from the late 1960s onwards, the Valium generation, where throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, millions of people in the West were prescribed Valium, an antidepressant and a tranquilizer, for essentially the problems of life. Who benefits from that? Well, not the patient, because they become addicted to a very dangerous drug. Not society as a whole, because you've got all these drugged-up zombies walking around. Who benefits? Hoffman and LaRoche and companies like this that have actually developed and sold these particular drugs. Now, they don't sell drugs directly to customers, as other industries do. Drugs are basically sold to people via doctors. So you can think of a more recent revolution, that of the so-called SSRI antidepressants, things like Prozac, been going now for about 20 years. Originally, Prozac was introduced very much as an antidepressant. Gradually, the number of so-called conditions that Prozac will treat has grown and grown and grown. And if you look at the literature produced by the manufacturers for indications that someone would be prescribed Prozac, pretty much all of us would be if we walked into our GP and admitted to having had any anxiety about anything, being unhappy about anything, being concerned about anything, having trouble to sleep about anything. Now, of course, sociologists would argue these are just normal parts of being human beings. And in the past, we just lived with these stresses and tribulations of everyday life. As my 96-year-old grandmother says, who's lived through 2 wars, in my day we didn't have depression, we just got on with it. And so what's happened now is these ordinary everyday stresses, my husband's getting on my nerves. Is that a medical condition? No. You need to get rid of your husband. But what happens in modern society is that's medicalised. You go to your doctor, and the doctor says, you don't like your husband, he's getting on your nerves, you're ill, have some Prozac. And it all feels better when you take the Prozac, because it knocks the edge off it, stops the reuptake of serotonin, so your whole emotional structure is flattened out. So your husband doesn't get on your nerves so much. So the Prozac has worked, and you're cured of your disease. So who benefits from that? Well, you might in a way, because you're not quite so irritated by your husband, but basically the beneficiary of that is the manufacturer of Prozac, the people that make the money out of the drugs. So by medicalising everyday life and using doctors as their agents to prescribe this stuff in response to ordinary human situations, you can argue that the role of the doctor actually benefits capital and actually benefits the owners or the shareholders of the major drug manufacturers. So why don't they spend much money looking for cures of malaria? Because people who get malaria don't have any money on the whole. I have malaria, I have any money, but I was a tourist, a traveller. But most people who get malaria are people who live in the malarial parts of the world, and they are amongst the poorest people in the world. So they can't afford to buy the drugs even if they don't. So it's not about the humanitarian efforts, it's about what makes the money. And this is not saying doctors are bad people or stupid people. It's just that the very structure of medicine is influenced heavily by the interests of pharmaceutical companies. So sociologists who follow the works of Karl Marx tend to argue that ultimately it is the economically powerful, those individuals that own the capital, that hold the resources in a society, are likely to benefit disproportionately from the social roles which exist. Take another example. Take that of a priest. The priest is someone who, basically in the Marxist line, persuades poor and disadvantaged people that it's okay to be poor and disadvantaged because God will reward them in heaven. So who benefits from that? The rich, because the poor put up with it. They say, I don't mind being poor, it's okay, because I'm going to go to heaven. So the Marxist argument would be the role of the priest is benefiting disproportionately those people that have the money. So you have to think about this as an alternative view when trying to assess the functions of social roles. And so what we have here is the idea, actually, of social structure. We're talking about social structures, which are collections of institutions, and institutions working together, which ultimately explain why individuals behave in the way they do. So the idea here is that individuals are not free agents. We're not making free choices. On the contrary, we're acting as the way we do because we're following roles, and these roles exist because they're driven by the powerful institutions and interests in society. And so sociologists who are interested in structure tend to concentrate on what roles, the ways in which these social roles continue to allow these institutions of society to persist and keep going. The idea is that patterns of behaviour are largely predictable. I told you your behaviour here is predictable. It continues to be completely predictable, and probably will be in everything you do today and for the rest of your lives. Now the question for us is, do we really buy this? I said there will be controversy here. Do we really believe that social roles are predictable in that way? Are you just behaving the way you do because you don't have any choice in the matter? Or do you feel you've got free choice to do the things you want to do? Who thinks they've got freedom of choice? None? Why did you come and study this course? Did you not make a decision? Did you not choose? Were you forced into it? So what choices do you have? What about the clothes you wear? You've got complete freedom of choice. You live in Singapore, you've got some of the biggest shopping centres in the world. You can get anything you want, wear anything you want. You've all made a choice about that. And yet, funnily enough, that choice turns out to be remarkably similar. So you've exercised choice, but in exercising choice you appear to be exhibiting entirely predictable and patterns of behaviour. However, some people would argue, and we'll see this in a minute, that we actually have more choice than we think. Now, I want to briefly just mention two approaches to studying social structures, the way in which all the institutions of society work together. Have you come across this person, Emile Durkheim? He was a French bloke with a beard, 19th century, first person to be employed as a professor of sociology at the University of Bordeaux in France. And he basically invented modern sociology. Durkheim was what we call today a functionalist. And by functionalist, what we mean is all of the roles in society, all of these roles, all of these institutions that we're talking about, exist for the benefit of that society. Okay? So the sick role is an example of that. It's good for the whole society. Now, Durkheim took what he thought was the most apparently harmful institution in society and showed us that actually it has some positive benefits. He took crime, because you can easily come back to a functionalist and say, well, it's all very well saying these institutions are good for society, but what about crime? How is crime good for society? Surely the purpose of a good society is to eradicate crime, get rid of it altogether. By the way, it's the case that Lee Kuan Yew was very influenced by Durkheim's sociology. He did study at the UOL briefly, and one of my tutors was actually his tutor about 50 years before, and said he was very taken with the works of Emile Durkheim. When you understand Durkheim, you'll understand as Singaporeans, or living in Singapore, how Durkheimian sociology was actually quite influential in the development of the modern Singapore and its approach to things like crime and punishment. Durkheim argued that crime had positive benefits for society. But how can crime have positive benefits? Well, he argued, if you didn't have crime, and in particular, punishment of criminals, then the rest of us wouldn't know where the boundaries of society were. The function of crime is to establish the boundaries of what is acceptable in a given society. So by people breaking the law, and those people being punished, for Durkheim, this was vital in setting the boundaries of what is and isn't acceptable. He said it also has another function, which is that if a society is too rigid, then it is impossible to have social change. If rules are too strict, how do we ever change those rules? And he argued that one way of getting change is to break those rules. And so if you think about most innovations socially, they began with somebody breaking an established rule. Copernicus effectively broke the law by challenging the old Ptolemaic theory of the universe. But without Copernicus, we wouldn't have modern science. Darwin effectively broke at least the rules, certainly the religious laws of his time, by proposing that Genesis was not literally true and that all life had come about by the process of evolution. People break laws which, for example, the Jim Crow laws in the United States, the laws separating black people and white people. By black people breaking those laws, eventually, they changed. They had to be reformed. They had to be repealed. So some law breaking can be useful as a vehicle for facilitating social change. Of course, the argument against that is there's lots of law breaking which is not useful and is very harmful. And indeed, lots of law breaking which is harmful for certain social groups. So if I've got no money, a little bit of money, and all my money is stolen, then arguably I've lost more than a man who loses only 5% of his huge wealth, even though the actual amount might be more. So that crime affects us differentially. Back to Parsons. Parsons says, let's say, what is the function of the family? What's it for? Well, it's really the family is all about socializing children. That is, giving children the initial lessons in how to be human, teaching them the basic rules of conduct, not to throw food at people, not to scream all the time, how to use a toilet and things like this, which is the primary socialization of children. And we need that, because otherwise if we had adults that were still like babies, society wouldn't work. So that's why we have the family. Its second function, because Parsons always liked to look for another one. One was never enough for him. Its second function is what he calls stabilization of adult personalities. That is, we're all us as adults going out in the world competing with each other. It's very stressful. But we can go home to our families and we can act like children and we can let off steam and we can have fun at home. It's a very idealized image of the family. I sometimes have this image of Professor and Mrs. Parsons having pillow fights at home in the bedroom just to deal with the stresses of everyday life. Third one, Kingsley Davis, who was a student of Parsons, talks about prostitution. We're back to Orchard Towers now. Generally speaking, prostitution is regarded as a very harmful thing in society. Women are forced into it because of economic reasons. There are pimps who exploit women. Men who visit prostitutes are often victims of crime as well as perpetrators of crime. There's the issue of sexually transmitted diseases and so on. Davis, however, points out that, making the premise that men's sexual appetites generally are greater than those of women, particularly when those for married men. So rather than married men going off and having affairs with other women, which might involve emotional attachment, ultimately breaking down their families, and the family unit thus ceasing to fulfill the functions that Parsons attributes to it, we have the institution of prostitution, so-called the world's oldest profession, where men can satisfy their needs in a harmless way that keeps the family together. So the prostitutes benefit because they earn money. The wives benefit, so they should be very pleased that there are prostitutes out there ready to take care of the needs of your husbands. And of course we should all be